Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Well done. Very well done. How's everybody?
Good.
Good. Is everybody ready for the talk?
Yeah.
Did everybody get sideways snow up their nose yesterday? No? Did anybody get the wind literally knocked out of them at any point yesterday? No? No? You guys are pretty... All right. Is everything that you own, or are all of your shoes at least stained in salt? More or less? Very good. All right, and I'll stop there. I feel like I've sort of already made my opening gesture here. So what we just engaged in, with varying degrees of excitement, is an example of antiphony, of call and response. And in a way, this opening exercise, already teaches us everything that we need to know about the call as a sonic act. So it expects a response. It has an addressee or addressees. That addressee only becomes apparent through performing the call, so performative in that sense of the term. Calls are delivered with varying degrees of force. I hope that I was not too forceful in doing so. Calls can fail in various ways. So I was actually kind of hoping that my first few attempts would get no responses, just so I could demonstrate failed calls as well. They can go unheard, they can go unrecognized, they can be misunderstood, and they can even be deliberately ignored, pointedly so. So calls can be found in lots of different musical practices, both traditional and contemporary. They've been perhaps most thoroughly examined and theorized in Afro-diasporic music, so musics of the Black Atlantic, broadly speaking. And indeed, actually, even the history of the Black Atlantic, as formulated by Paul Gilroy, the cultural flows in his words, have sometimes been described as call and response, a call and response across the Atlantic. At the same time, though, we should resist, or I would encourage us to resist the temptation to reduce the wide array of Afro-diasporic musical practices to call and response. There are many other things that go on in that range of musical practices and cultures. And at the same time, I, of course, want to avoid treating the African continent or the larger diaspora as a cultural monolith, right? So there's lots of diversity going on there as well. Nonetheless, call and response is a trope, so to speak, that's especially resonant in broadly understood sort of Africanist scholarship. So calls permeate sonic life everywhere, including but not limited to music. And this is sort of my sound studies legalese caveat, in the sense that I'm in some ways framing this as a sound studies paper or talk. I'm talking about sonic acts, but I will be mostly working through music examples, so I'm just going to cop to that immediately. I'm mostly looking at music today. But nonetheless, I'm also trying to think about calls as something that exists beyond the realm of the musical as well, right? So nobody feel excluded is pretty much what I'm trying to say. So throughout today's talk, I'll be thinking about calls as sonic acts, that is, as more than just a metaphor or figure of speech. I'll also be considering calls as genres of sociability, that is, bundles of conventions and expectations about social interaction. Finally, I'll highlight the ethical ambivalence at work in calls, using force to push and pull people around social webs of belonging and exclusion. Taking some inspiration from 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza, I'm less interested in what a call is for today's purposes and more what it can do. So I'm interested in what kinds of things a call can do. And so to answer this question, I'll draw upon a set of examples taken from electronic dance music primarily, although you'll see that's a relatively broad umbrella that I'm casting here. So some of this will shade into hip hop, for example. Some of this will shade into dubka, those of you who are familiar with that. But in any case, I'll be drawing upon this particular set of musical examples, all of which feature calls in some way, at least by my interpretation. So I'll begin with an analysis of a music video, so that is what's coming next, partly to ground the theoretical work to come, but also to keep your attention. There's much more music and videos to come, so there is a reward at the end, so to speak. There's going to be lots of very interesting music videos. But first you have to sit through me talking a little bit more. I will engage, so after this music video, I'll do a little bit of a sort of a quick analysis, and then I'm going to engage in a bit of a linguistic gloss of the verb to call. So I'll spend some time sort of as a conceptual warm-up exercise. I'll try to map out the complex semiotic landscape of what calls can do and what sorts of things, calls can do, and what sorts of forms they can take as well. And this sort of scattershot concept mapping will then hopefully take focus through a brief engagement with Louis Althusser's notion of interpolation, as well as James R. Martell's misinterpolation as a sort of an update, but also kind of a critical response in some senses to the concept of interpolation. And then your reward for sitting through the glosses and the concept mappings and the post-Gramscian Marxist theory of ideology will be a barrage of musical case studies grouped to highlight common patterns that I think at least underlie what makes a call a call. And finally, at the end here, I will turn to the messy and tentative business of trying to theorize the call. So I am kind of very explicitly trying to do conceptual work here as well. So by the end of this, I'm going to try to come up with some idea of what could be the call instead of a call in the general. The call as a sonic act, as a genre of sociability, and as an ambivalent ethics. But first let's get to the fun bit, or at least the fun opening. So I'm presenting, or we're going to start with a music video by Shoma Josie. The song itself is called Dumi Phone, and you'll see that there's some emojis there in the title. Those are actually taken directly from the emojis that are part of the title as it's found on YouTube, which was its initial point of dissemination. So I'm treating it as integral to the title. And you'll also notice that some of my slides incorporate emojis anyways, so there is that as well. So Shoma Josie is a rapper, poet, and screenwriter. She works almost exclusively in Xitsonga, which is a Bantu language group primarily found in and around the Limpopo province, sort of northeast of Johannesburg in South Africa. Notably, she rarely provides translations. And so for the video that we're going to see, there are no subtitles. I'll provide you with a bit of guidance, so to speak, or a little bit of framing as to what to expect lyrically. I managed to track down one video somewhere on the net where she sort of grudgingly provides a bit of not a direct translation, but a sort of an indirect summary of some of what's going on here. But normally when she's asked about the meaning of lyrics, she says, "Go and ask a Tsongan," which itself is sort of an interesting sort of stance and gesture that she makes. She has training in Mount Holyoke in the US, as well as at the University of Johannesburg, and when last I checked, I think she's still based in Johannesburg, in Joburg. So, the song itself, Dumi Phone. So it's from an album which came out recently, so this is fresh new music. So it came out just last December on an album called Limpopo Champions League. The genre is, Om. So this is a kind of a hybrid of Kwaito, in some senses of Kwaito being South Africa's, South Africa's indigenous house music style, so electronic dance music from the 90s going into the early 2000s. On the other hand, pulls from this, but also pulls from hip-hop, both local hip-hop as well as global flows of things like grime, for example, as well, UK grime. In particular, Qom has a very notable or very sort of, it has a sort of a sonic hallmark that can be found in a drum pattern, a bass drum pattern that you should be able to pick up on pretty quickly. It's like an ostinato, it runs through the whole track. But notably, Qom is primarily based in Durban, or it's associated with the city of Durban, and to some degree with Johannesburg as well. So I think it's also interesting that, and there are some visual cues in the music video as well that sort of note that that Shoma Josie herself is from Limpopo province, so not from Durban, has slightly different sort of cultural local references. And in particular, pay attention to or look out for the shibelani, which is a particular kind of ruffled skirt, which traditionally in Tsongan dancing, usually worn by women and is usually, well, you'll see it once you'll get some great visuals, so I'm not going to try to over-describe it verbally, but the point is to get all of the sort of ruffles in the skirt to bounce in a particular rhythmic way, which requires a great deal of skill. So, beyond that, you have a major hook in the song is here. You'll see, I have a sort of a kind of translation of it. Sister Majosi is phone famous. So the overall sort of narrative of the song is something along the lines of, I'm a rising musician and a star. I'm also a party girl, party animal. I like to go hard. I'm getting famous. I'm sick of answering questions about my life and my lifestyle and where I'm from and what I do. So if you have any questions, hit me up on my phone because I'm phone famous. All right, so that's sort of the overall arc of the video. And so there's a few interesting ways in which calls come in here already that I want to just sort of flag for us. So one is the imagery of telephony, that telephones are kind of all over the video, both physical ones as well as mimed ones, as well as the kind of interactions that are supposed to come, that are supposed to arise from conversations. But also, right from the beginning, you'll hear a kind of a vocative interjection, "Hey, yay," and that'll come back at various points. And it's interesting on the one hand as a kind of as a kind of a call, right? A call that doesn't necessarily have lexical content, but nonetheless, draws attention, pulls people in, and as the song goes on, it will return in certain kind of rhythmic ways that also entrain, or at least can entrain listeners. It can sort of bring people into the flow of the song. Similarly, there's sort of a built-in call and response to the hook. So the hook itself, if it says something like, Sister Majosi is phone famous, right, Dumi ifon, at the end of each line, you'll hear something like, iya, right? And so that iya also, from my understanding, from what I could figure out, I think that's supposed to translate to something like go or let's go. But similarly, that almost always comes at the end of these lines. And I think I see that as also feeding into a certain kind of rhythm of call and response. And then finally, here's just a spelling of the shibelani, the traditional Tongan dancing skirt, which you will see at various points in the video. So I have lots of other videos that I'll show you later on, but this is the one that I will show pretty much back to front, the entirety of it, partially because it's a really rich text, but also because I think there'll be a lot of what I'll be talking about in the more sort of abstract sense later on is really kind of nicely concretized in this video. Also, it's a great video for that reason too. All right, so let's get started.
Matos. Hey, hey. Hey, hey. Hey, hey. Hey, hey. Coming in this way. Look, I'm like, MMaP is me. Party since Tuesday. Wanna it's a new wave. You wouldn't wanna bother stopping me cause it's too late. Kasi irapa she in my dose. Kasi if I'm bella in the adose. Minna she would this so listen is good. Loco in lava nico me food. Nico me food. Sasi my josie it to me food. Mitana wanda banga never way. Hambina loco bo fika bate. Ali look mitami wanda bajala and mara look minna me veta mite. Namun tareta zerbel. Namun taminga tele. Mina tatana banga naba me. Boba tatana banga naba bo. Hey tatana banga naba e. Ibi iramba banga naba we. Sesi majosi to me food. It to me food. Loco ilava ni to me food. Ni to me food. Sesi majosi to me food. It to me food. Sesi majosi to me food. It to me food. Loco in lava ni to me food. Hey, hey. Ni to me food. Sesi majosi to me food. Hey, hey. It to me food. Loco in lava ni to me food. Hey, hey. Ni to me food. Sesi majosi to me food. Hey, hey. It to me food. Asking where my table is. Ordering things that I can't even buy, but checking what the label is. Sending a night 2 by 2. Cover the braids, cover the do. My jaws are new, I'm telling the truth.
PSTJs.
Sesi my jaws eat to me food. Eat to me food. Loco in lava ni to me food. Ni to me food. Sesi my jaws eat to me food. Eat to me food. Sesi my jaws eat to me food. It to me food. Loco in lava ni to me food. Hey, hey. Nico me food. Sese majosi to me food. Hey, yeah, it to me food.
All right, I'll pause it there. As much as I'd love to run the whole thing through. Now, I'm going to play another video for you, one that will hopefully add an extra layer of interpretation to what you just saw. So, interestingly enough, I was able to find a reaction video to this video, in particular by this group called Ubunifu, which is a social media group based in the UK, Nairobi, and also Kenya. Their members identify as Ugandan, Nigerian, Kenyan, Zimbabwean, Ghanaian, and Cameroonian. And they have a mission, their group's mission is to promote popular music from Africa by uploading reaction videos to music videos of African artists. So, just my luck, they did one for Dumi Ifon. And I'm not going to play the whole thing, obviously, but I will play a little snippet. In particular, I'm going to play a snippet where I want to draw your attention to how the folks who are watching, essentially, I think that there's a sort of a process of entrainment that happens over time, in particular in response to the iya and the eye, these sort of like responses that come at the end of phrases and the hooks. So you can sort of hear that happening because there is a bit of a voice track. You can sort of hear them chattering and occasionally making comments over the video, but also pay attention in particular to facial expressions and to hand gestures and to how people are moving to the music as it's going on. In particular, let's see, I'll pull up the poster shot here. So in particular, pay attention to these four, I would say, in particular. I feel like they're the most sort of responsive to this. So I'll pause it there and move on. So, and here I tip into slightly more sort of prepared notes, just full disclosure. So I have bits here that are more sort of formalized presentation notes, and then there are bits here where I'll be extemporizing a bit more, hopefully to not bore you completely with reading off of paper. So, making calls. Calls permeate musical and sonic life. They serve to alert, invoke, name, and bind people, and other entities for that matter, into social webs. When calls feature prominently in ethnomusicology, for example, the antiphonal call and response structure discussed at the opening here, they're usually celebrated for their pro-social aspects, emphasizing the ways that they renew and solidify community. So from this perspective, calls appear to function as a kind of social imperative, an order that orders, that reproduces social order, that calls us to order. Social order, however, is not always benign. What if the call emanates from oppressive authority, binding you to stigma, for example, or exposing you to harm? I'm interested here in the, hold on, I've of course now forgotten where I am. I'm interested here in the ethically and politically ambiguous ramifications of the call in musical and sonic life, particularly in situations where social relations are shot through with antagonism and risk. I'm interested in exploring the call as a sonic act. Here we go. A genre of sociability and as an ambivalent ethics. In other words, as a genre of sonic address, here we go, I overshot things. There we go. Right. So in other words, I'm interested in the call as a genre of sonic address that exerts social force, thus drawing its addressees into relations of power and ethics. Right? So I'm very, very interested in not just giving a sort of pastoral, celebratory account of the call. Right? The call can also do bad things, so to speak, or it's not a, I don't see the call as a essentially morally good or bad thing, right? But rather a thing that vectorizes power in particular ways. So before trying to theorize the call as an analytic concept, let's take Shoma Josie's advice, that very first title screen, to flourish and multiply. So let's do a gloss. Let's consider calls in the plural through all of the ways in which the English verb to call can describe actions and relations. And so here I'm going to admit that this is an Anglocentric gloss. I'm mostly working on from the verb to call in English. The 5 other languages that I speak have similar range of connotations for their cognate words, but the promiscuity of the English language yields very rich results. So I feel like there's good reason to stick with English for now. I think in the future it'd be very interesting to actually pull this out or sort of widen the scope and think about how the concept of the call may or may not work so well in other linguistic environments. So, with that, one can start with the verb to call in and of itself without any of the kind of phrasal endings. And we can think of the call as, or we can think not of the call, but rather to call. Calling, we can think of calling a person, calling an identity or an epithet, so in the sense of street harassment or catcalling, right? Applying a particular, forcefully applying a particular identity or name to somebody. But also for those of you who work in IT or who code at all, right? To call is also to call a function or a routine in programming, right? And also in the world of square dancing, right? To call is also an activity to direct action in a particular way. You can also call up. You can call somebody up through the telephone, or more broadly speaking, through various modes of telecommunication. You can also call up records and data. So for example, from archives and databases and so on, right? You can call up information. Also on the web, when you're doing a search, you can call up information in that way. You can also call on in various ways. You can call on a person in a classroom environment, for example. You can single them out for assessment and performance. You can put them under pressure, perhaps, or expose them to attention. You can also call on somebody in the sense of a social visit, right, to come calling, also to leave calling cards, a practice which is not as practiced these days, but 100 and some years ago, calling cards were serious business. You can also think of calling on in the sense of selecting or prompting somebody to perform, right, such as in musical auditions. We can also think of the call to action, the call to prayer, the call to various forms of political solidarity, and so on, right? So the call to some kind of an activity. And we can also think of the call for, and I'd see this as sort of related to the call to, right? The call for political action, the call for unity or solidarity, but also the call for ingredients and recipes. I'm actually very interested, as I was going through the kind of gloss of this, all the kind of, almost sort of off-label or off-brand uses of the term call, and what those maybe open up for how we might understand the call in a broader sense. Things, an ingredient calling, or a recipe calling for certain ingredients, I think is also really interesting. You can also call in. To call in the sense of a social visit, right? But also to participate in a meeting via teleconferencing, right? To call in various ways. You can also call into a radio and TV show, which is a common occurrence, especially in the world of electronic dance music, various online, especially the so-called sort of pirate radio stations, which are now just internet streaming stations like NTS, Rinse, just to name a few. Often, not always, but will often have sort of call-in portions to their shows. Sometimes as a way of just showing or demonstrating that their show is live and not pre-recorded, which is also a common occurrence in online radio. But also the phrase to call in more recent usage has been developed as, particularly in political activist circles, social justice circles, and so on, as a sort of non-ostracizing version of the call out. Right? Instead of calling somebody out on something, to call them in, to encourage them to do better, to change their ways, to educate themselves, etc., but not to be excluded from the group as a result of the call out, right? But then also we can think of the call out, right? We can think of the call out as something to draw attention to a problem. We can also think of the call out as the request, a request for help or services. So, for example, emergency services get called out to particular locations or to particular events. Similarly, if something terrible has happened to your plumbing, right, you will call out somebody to come out and hopefully repair your plumbing. But also, in this more modern, or let's say not more modern, but more recent usage, to call out can also mean to single somebody out for attention and or sanction. So if we look back over this list that I've just given you here, and we add some sort of not quite synonymous verbs, but if we try to add a little bit of detail to what these various versions of calling come to, we see, or at least I see a set of patterns here, right? So I see identification, right, the assignation of identity, but also things like instruction, right, giving instruction, opening up contact in various ways, or seeking contact, initiating contact, but also summoning and invoking, right, with all the kind of power relations that at least are implied by that. Also things like appeal, right, to make a plea, to appeal to something, and then also to call in, to intervene. I think that's also interesting, the ways in which a call can be understood as an intervention. Later on, I'll be thinking about the call as well as an interruption at times. And then finally, the call out as a signal, as an alert, right? Something that pulls attention toward it for any number of reasons. And also, I mean, I'm leaving out things like to call after, to call back, to recall. There is a certain kind of almost infinite regress that I will not be doing here, but I want to sort of point to the fact that one of the interesting things about call, or the notion of the call, at least in the English lexicon, is how broad and flexible and deep the word is, right? In how many different ways it can be used. And so here, before I move on, so this slide here provides kind of a different ordering of the same information that I had in the previous slide. So I'm not going to read through it all, but rather just sort of want to leave this up here for a second and let you all process it. But you'll sort of see some of the words that I've highlighted here. What's interesting for me, so here, whereas before I was thinking about the call as, in the Spinozan sense of what it can do, right, actions. Here I'm thinking about it a little bit more in the sense of ontology and what kind of a thing it is, however briefly. So I'm sort of reframing some of what I was mentioning earlier as things like, the call is also a signal, the call can be an order, right? The call can be an attempt to communicate, it can be an interruption, it can be harassment, right? It can be a claim, you can make a claim, and I actually thought that bird calls as territorializing gestures or actions, famously theorized by Deleuze and Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus, is one example, but also things like pleas, alerts, designations, and even charges, right, to call for. So these are some of the ways that we can sort of noun the verb, if you know what I mean. And so finally, here I'm just going to sort of close up this section, but we're going to come back to this later. But to sort of wrap things up, what can a call do? So a call can invoke and conjure by naming. It can project or throw identity at things, and the question of whether that identity sticks is another thing, right? But it's sort of, I like something about that metaphor, not the metaphor, but the image of the call as a thing that throws something as well. Not just sound, but also something that goes with it. The calls are things that push and pull, and by that I mean that they have social forces, right? And they can push you away, they can pull you in, and that pulling in can be both benign or malevolent, right? Or any gradation of things in between. If anything, it can be extremely messy and ambivalent. And calls seize attention, or at least they seem to seek to seize attention, right? Whether or not they're always successful in doing that is another question. So I want to spend a bit of time thinking about interpolation and misinterpolation. This is about as dense as things will get. After that, we will be turning towards the fun bits. So stay with me. At the same time, I think some of this will be review, I think, for a lot of the folks in the room. So also, those of you who are already familiar with this, bear with me in the other sense of the word, as I sort of plow through a sort of potted, not a potted history, but a summary of Althusser, who's otherwise this massive sort of mess of theory. So here's Althusser and misinterpolation as well in like 5 minutes or less. So I understand calls through Louis Althusser's notion of interpolation, the process by which individuals are made into subjects by recognizing themselves as participants in dominant ideology. Hold on, I'm just going to pull this whole slide down for you. There you go. So Althusser developed this concept in his writings on ideology, and what he termed termed ideological state apparatuses. That is, institutions that perpetuate hegemonic ideology. Hegemony here understood in connection to Gramscian theory, right? So ideology here in the sense of values, beliefs, and broader worldviews. So I'm gonna reread that sentence again for you. So Althusser developed this concept in his writings on ideology and what he termed ideological state apparatuses. That is, institutions that perpetuate hegemonic ideology, values, beliefs, and broader worldviews on behalf of the state, or on behalf of the ruling class, depending on quite how you want to read it. So in contrast to repressive state apparatuses, which was another kind of set of apparatuses that Althusser was theorizing, so in contrast to the repressive ones, which use the threat of direct violence to ensure the dominance of the ruling class, ideological state apparatuses disseminate ideology in order to persuade dominated classes to accept their subjugation as inescapable, as normal, as the natural order of things. So for Althusser saw ideological state apparatuses at work in the educational system, like universities, also in religious organizations, the family, media, culture, and so on. So Althusser was especially concerned with how ideology mediates, between individuals and systems of power, suggesting that individuals become subjects through their encounters with ideology and the institutions that propagate them. That is, through their encounters with institutional state apparatuses. So, central to this process was interpolation, a form of, oh, hellos. That was the funny bit that I was going to get to a little bit later. All right, how are we doing? There we go. All right, so, central to this process was interpolation, a form of hailing that calls a recipient into a particular subject position. So, as an example here, Althusser provides a scenario, and it's a sonic scenario, a sonic example, right, where a police officer calls out on the street, "Hey, you there." Whoever hears that call and turns in response becomes the subject of that call. Of particular importance to this process is the way in which individuals are made to be complicit in their own entanglement in ideology. By recognizing themselves in the call, they acknowledge their identity as the person for whom the call is addressed, right, or to whom the call is addressed. Or at least this is the way that Althusser sort of dramatizes the bind of interpolation, right? That when you're called a thing, if you turn around and recognize it, even if you don't like the thing you're being called, by hearing it and turning, you already are saying, yes, that's me, in some sense, right? In some admittedly ambivalent and perhaps very poignant sense. And so this is the image that I've been pulling out for the last little while to talk about interpolation with students and so on. This is from the co-op in the UK. They've actually discontinued this now, apparently. Not because of me, I don't think. But for a while they were selling man-sized tissues, which were just a really large box of tissue, like wide, extremely wide. But then they came around and decided that they needed ultra-soft man-sized tissues. So they were marketing ultra-soft man-sized tissues. And what's interesting about this, aside from just sort of, laughing at the kind of unnecessary gendering of things that, consumer goods that maybe don't need to be gendered. What's interesting about this is the way in which this and, even the visual marketing of it is a form of interpolation, right? In the sense that you can imagine what is the kind of masculinity that, that a group of marketing folks around a table were thinking of when they made this. Who do they think that they were going to connect to with this? Who do they think was going to buy this? And then also are there people, presumably there were some folks who saw this on a shelf and thought, that's me, right? Or at least this is the thing for me, maybe not that's me, right? So thinking about, for me at least, consumer culture, broadly speaking, is a great, in quotation marks, place to look for the kind of, the insidious pervasiveness of interpolation and the way in which it sort of helps to assign or build up identity, right? So, moving on. The workings of interpolation, as Althusser describes it, can seem bleakly suffocating. Much like with Foucault's account of power and resistance, there seems to be no way out of interpolation, no way to fight it. Much like Michel de Certeau's notions of détournement, bricolage, and braconnage, all of which provide ways of identifying and exploiting the cracks in the systems of power that Foucault describes, James R. Martell's notion of misinterpolation, or interpolation gone wrong, provides a similar sort of service, if that's the right word, or it opens up some opportunities, some cracks in the system for us. So in his 2017 monograph, The Misinterpolated Subject, Martel claims that interpolation is never accurate. Returning to the sonic example of being hailed on the street by a policeman, even if the call is intended for someone in particular, everyone within hearing range is exposed to it and may recognize themselves in it and therefore respond in kind. Right? Anybody could be the subject of a call as long as they're in earshot. So, in this monograph, he looks at a couple of different historical and literary examples, but the most interesting and I think the most sort of significant one is he looks at the Haitian Revolution, and he provides a historical account of that where some of the motivation of the Haitian Revolution comes from seeing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on from the French Republic, from their colonial masters, and saying, okay, well, if it's universal and human, well, we're human, so we demand these rights as well, right? And so Martel would frame that as misinterpolation. Misinterpolation in the sense of responding to a call that was not meant for you, right? Sometimes strategically, like as in the case of the Haitian Revolution. I also sort of read this kind of misrecognition connecting back to de Certeau as a kind of détournement, a turning back on itself of authoritarian imperatives, right? So as one way to sort of work with interpolation, to work against it, to sort of turn it on itself. And for me, at least, especially as somebody who works primarily in queer nightlife scenes and otherwise scenes of marginalized, dance music scenes that involve marginalized groups, one thing that's really compelling for me about the concept of misinterpolation is the idea of turning up where you don't belong, right? And what is the kind of political potential of showing up where you were not invited and nonetheless being there and persisting. And here, I would also want to take a very brief moment to thank very deeply Eva Penzis, who is a University of Chicago grad student, doctoral student, with whom she was essentially a major part of coming up with the idea for this project. She was the one who sort of proposed thinking about interpolation in relation to calls and call-outs and call-ins and so on. She's working on her own project in relation to this, but we're also working on some stuff together. There will hopefully be some collaborative stuff that comes out of this. So I want to make sure that she also gets a bit of time, a bit of sunlight, so to speak. And I also want to mention, I just want to also draw a little bit of attention to her work, which is really fantastic. So Eva is currently a doctoral student at the University of Chicago, both in music and in theater and performance. Her work concerns the space between queer nightlife, survival economies, and popular culture. She focuses on performances of femininity on the stage and in the street across the 20th and 21st centuries with an attention to how disreputable femininities, and by that she means trans, black, fat, poor, street, and freak femininities, how such disreputable femininities are produced and represented in distinction to respectable femininity. And so her current research project examines the contributions of street queens and trans women to LGBTQ cultural formations, particularly as they go unrecognized in both academic accounts of gay history and in pop culture's appropriations of them. So I'm very grateful to Eva Penzis for her contributions to today's presentation. So we're getting towards the end of the theoretical bit here. A handful of scholars have written about musical interpolation. So in other words, here's where we turn towards music with this notion of interpolation. So a few scholars have explored how this concept provides a model for how music produces subjects and perpetuates ideology. So one of the things that I like about this, or one of the things that's interesting about this line of analysis, is that there is this tendency, broadly speaking, or there's a trope in a lot of music studies, ethnomusicological or otherwise, of music brings people together, music is great, music is pro-social, music is a good thing at all times, right? And fine, but also music can also perpetuate ideology. Music can bring people together, but around, for example, fascist politics, right? So there's something useful in thinking about musical interpolation to think about the sort of the relays of power that are embedded, that can be embedded in that, right? So the scholars who have worked so far with musical interpolation that I've come across, they note the sonic dimensions of Althusser's explanatory example. So this example of the police officer in the street yelling, "Hey, you," it's already all sonic, right? And oral, right? So They note the sonic dimensions of this example. One is hailed from any direction through sound, beyond vision notably, right? So that you often won't be in a sight line. Or in this example, as Althusser mentions it, you're usually not facing the police officer. You hear something because hearing is omnidirectional in that sense, and then your sight line turns towards the police officer. And if anything, it is only when the visual is aligned with the audio as far as attention is concerned, it's only when those two sensory channels come into alignment that interpolation has occurred, right, or has completed, that the process is completed. So MoIT, as I have listed here, and Gavin Steingo, who will be on the next slide as well, both note that because hearing is omnidirectional, as I was just saying, and automatically receptive, right, you can't sort of opt out of being receptive to sound, aside from stopping up your ears or having noise-canceling headphones. The call always already addresses everybody within range of hearing, even if only some of them recognize themselves in the sound. So Steingo goes on to argue that music thus functions as a, quote, device of mass interpolation. So I think this is really interesting. In particular, he's thinking of things like the use of music at festivals and political rallies and so on, right? So because sound and sound, especially through a sound speaker system like this, because it's a broadcast system, because it has a wide kind of blast range, right? That if we're thinking of the call as a kind of interpolation, then we can think of amplified sound systems and music and so on as devices of mass interpolation, at least when they're sort of weaponized in that way or when they're activated in that way. So he calls it mass interpolation or device mass interpolation because it hails everybody within earshot, while each individual knows that other listeners are being hailed. So that's what makes it mass, that it isn't just that people are responding to and being engaged with or being hailed by the music individually, but that they're also aware that others are also being hailed by it. And that is the slight but important difference from the Althusserian notion of hailing, where you respond individually to the call and may be entirely ignorant of who else is also feeling hailed by that call. So thus, collective engagement with the same music, implies a process of collective subject formation for Gavin Steingo. So interpolation can thus help us understand how musical and sonic calls draw bodies out of anonymity and into webs of obligation, responsibility, solidarity, and or control, thus setting the terms of social belonging and exclusion. It suggests that it is not only the content and manner of response that matters, but the feeling of being hailed, and the ethical pull such feeling can engender. Indeed, refusal, unresponsiveness, and indifference are all potential tactics of resistance to those subjected to unwelcome interpolation, right? That we don't have to engage, and in fact, there are lots of ways to disengage. So for the purposes of this presentation, in any case, I do not wish to limit interpolation to just the workings of hegemony and oppression. So, so far I've been somewhat bleak about how these things work, or I've been mostly sort of focusing on the somewhat top-down repressive forms. But indeed, one does not need to look very far in the world of electronic dance music, and popular music more broadly, to find copious examples of calls emanating from subaltern or otherwise non-hegemonic positions. So yes, there are nonetheless copious examples in the world of electronic dance music, popular music more broadly, of calls, and calls that I would consider interpolative, engaging with these processes of interpolation, but coming from positions that are subaltern or otherwise not hegemonic, not at the top of the power pyramid, so to speak. So in the context of electronic dance music in particular, I want to leave open the possibility that marginal voices in the world of electronic dance music can call listeners and dancers into new identities, into new subjectivities, new ethical relations, new social roles, and so on. Right? So for me, that's where there's a certain kind of emancipatory or at least sort of positive potential. That's where the sunlight on the horizon is, as far as I'm concerned. So let's get to the case studies. We've been through the theory. Let's now listen to and watch a few videos. So I want to start, I sort of group these in various ways. You'll see the grouping here. So my first grouping is, hey you. So I'm interested here in examples, musical examples that call out and call attention, but also attach identity in various ways. Both of these are by an artist named Fatima Al Qadiri, who was born, actually, I'm now of course blanking on it. I believe she was born in Senegal, but mostly grew up in Kuwait. In particular, for her musical aesthetic, she was a teenager during Operation Desert Storm and living in Kuwait, and her sort of musical and technological world was the internet, was the kind of mod tracker music culture as it was on the internet in the 90s, the PC desktops, like the old sort of Windows desktops, all of which are part of her sort of artistic aesthetic. If you go and find her artist website, unless she's changed it recently, her artist website looks like an old Windows desktop. And in order to find various things like artists and so on, you have to go through folders and click through things. And she sort of forces you to interact through an old Windows interface. Both of these tracks come from a more recent release, or by release I mean a single, right, an EP, by Fatima Al Qadiri. This is the release in total is called Shanira, and this image. Hold on, I'm going to take you to the first video so you can see this image. This image here. This is not what Fatima Al Qadiri normally looks like. She normally actually works. She serves generally a kind of short haircut, butch, queer kind of look. Right? And so this is a real departure, but it's a deliberate departure. She's been interviewed, or in interviews she has described the project as having to do, being based on an English mispronunciation of the word shaniya, which translates to outrageous, nefarious, hideous, major, and foul. And the term shaniya is used in the Gulf Arabic-speaking sphere as queer slang for an evil queen. So the lyrics across all of the tracks in this EP, and we're only going to hear 2 of them, but there's I think 5 in total. They're performed in a mixture of Kuwaiti and Egyptian Arabic. Some of them are half improvised, some are lifted from disparate sources, such as Grindr chats. Grindr is how to put it, the Tinder for gays, for primarily cis male gays, I have to admit, and online drag comedy skits, especially Lebanese online drag comedy skits. So we're not going to get the full range of that here, but we're going to get a couple of examples. So I'm going to play first Galbi. Galbi translates roughly to heart, and in fact you'll only hear one. Or there's very little in the way of sort of lyrical content, and that's kind of deliberate. I want us to also think about the sonic aspects of this. I mean, sorry, that's not quite the right framing here. Everything is sonic, right? But including the lyrics. But I want us to think beyond the lyrics and to also think about texture, sonic texture, instrumentation, and so on. And also actually just the texture of the voice itself. But to give you an idea of what you're going to be hearing text-wise, nonetheless, you'll be hearing Ya Galbi, Ya Galbi, Ya Umri, which means something like, oh my heart, oh my heart, oh my life. And I'll leave it at that. There's no video per se to go with this. So you'll just get to stare at her for a couple of minutes. right? There's no good place to cut this off. That was the best as I could do. So I'm going to speak about this track in sort of in combination with the next track, which is also an Al Qadiri track. But I will say before I move on, or I'll highlight, I'll flag here, you know, the vocative sort of mood or the vocative address, right, being used here both linguistically, but also just with the melodic line there, which at least for me, to my ear, reminds me a lot of sort of cry breaks in country music, or for that matter, in you know, in certain, especially música norteña from the north of Mexico, the certain kinds of vocal inflections that vocal inflections that imply emotional intensity, that imply certain kinds of distress or certain kinds of longing, maybe perhaps even yearning in various ways. And the fact that that is sort of doubled with a synth line, right? Notably, what's interesting, or for me, you know, one of the things that's quite interesting about this track and the next is that this is an artist, Fatima Al Qadiri is somebody who works very, who's very sort of deeply entrenched, if that's the right word, in the world of like UK bass music. She works a lot with a lot of sort of post-dubstep genres, so genres that make use of these sort of somewhat asymmetrical bass rhythm patterns. And she's also at the same time working with, partially in the upper mid-range, you might be hearing some of the percussion instruments that are being applied here are also, can be described as khaliji, so essentially traditional percussion, especially sort of hand drum percussion and so on. That would be traditional to the Gulf region. So there's a bit of, not quite fusion, but there's something interesting going on here. And all of this is overlaid with this reference, you know, the entire project is referencing essentially a queer subcultural, well, phrased differently actually, the pan-Gulf, the Arab, you know, or Persian Gulf queer sort of sphere, right? This is something where she's speaking to Kuwaiti experiences, but also to a broader, you know, Qatari and let's say, you know, broader sort of Gulf experience of queerness and gender. So with that in mind, watch a little bit of Spiral. So one of the things that's interesting here with Spiral is that the lyrics of Spiral, what you'll hear, verbally, the vocal samples themselves come from an artist who's here named as Bobo Secret. Almost all of the sort of featured artists, the vocalists who are featured in these recordings, are anonymous, right? These are not their real names. These are mostly, according to Al Qadiri, queer, trans, and gender non-binary friends and contacts that she had in that region of the world, and that she was drawing on and asking to contribute their voice to the project. So in particular, part of what you'll hear over and over in different versions, and I've yet to track down a precise transcription of the Arabic line that I could provide you here, but I have a translation nonetheless. So there is. This is taken from what is now apparently a legendary scene in an Egyptian comedy film called Ayazon from 2006, where there's this sort of joyous eruption of belly dancing in the middle of a political rally, which happens to be held in a brothel. And you know, to the embarrassment of the political political operative, so to speak. And at one point, someone during a sort of transition towards joyous, sort of sexualized dancing, somebody says, "I'm wearing a dancing outfit, and I am in a house of ill repute." Sometimes this is also translated as bordello or brothel. Apparently, this phrase was picked up within the sort of queer subcultural sphere of, you know, sort of pan-Arab sphere, but specifically also the Gulf sphere, as this sort of body-positive, sex-positive expression of resistance, so to speak, to various kind of regimes of bodily oppression. So, with that in mind, this one does come with a video, so you'll be hearing some things that are familiar from the previous track. You'll be seeing a very virtuosic belly dance performance by two performers, by Zadi Sasmaz and Eli El Sultan, and they'll be part of, and this is, I think, something that's interesting to the whole track. They'll be doing a sort of a dance-off between a femme and a masc version of belly dancing. So you get sort of too gendered, but they wouldn't go quite so far as to say male and female, but feminized or feminine and masculine versions of belly dancing. And unfortunately, I'm not going to play the whole thing, but it's great, and I definitely encourage folks to look it up and see the whole thing themselves. That's a great place to stop. So that last sort of expression, that last call there at the end, minhara, as far as I can translate, I'm not fluent in Arabic, but from what I could get, minhara means something along the lines of I'm hot. So what I find interesting with those two examples, before I move on to the next two, are the ways in which the vocative is being used, the ways in which, on the one hand, attention is being called, but also the ways in which calls are being used, both to identify the caller and in some ways to sort of position the listener as the addressee in ways in ways that are sort of shot through with eros, with desire. But also with ambivalent identities as far as gender is concerned, and that actually for me is a sort of a useful point of connection or a bridging point to this set of examples that I want to look at here, which I've sort of put under the subtitle of call in, call out, and I'm imagining the first video that we're going to watch as more call in a sense. So I'll start with this video. This is entitled Uyang Kumbula, which translates roughly to "Do you remember?" It's by an art collective based in South Africa. They're based in Johannesburg, called Faka, spelled F-A-K-A. They describe this track as being a nostalgic journey through teenage romance, the policing of bodies, and speaking against heteronormativity. Elsewhere, I've seen sort of narrative summaries of this video by the artists, where they highlight or they note that part of the lyrics also have to do. It's sort of addressed in the second person again. And it has to do with speaking to young men that they had romantic encounters with early in their teen years, who've gone on to live heteronormative lives, gone on to have families and so on, etc. And the part of the story here, if anything, part of the "Do you remember" essentially is a certain kind of calling in the sense of, do you remember the kinds of connections we had, the kind of romance we have you forgotten, etc., etc. Notably, this is also an example of gom, right? So this is another example of this particular musical style. You should recognize the drum patterns, particularly the bass drum, the bass kick pattern should be quite familiar in comparison to Dumi Ifon, the very first track that we heard. And notably, this collective, because this is also part of the kind of political edge to their performance, when they've been interviewed about who they are and what they do, they mention that Faka itself as a word, at least in Isixhosa and Zulu, can mean words like to fuck, right? It can be very sort of it can have very direct, sort of forceful meaning. They themselves say that this also, for them, means directly things like insertion, penetration. They really want to emphasize this. And part of why they emphasize this is because they say that, and here, let me see if I can find the quote here. There we go. They say, we've defined Faka as an act of penetrating spaces that exclude us, right? And they associate themselves with a particular form of feminism that they describe as siakaka. Siakaka also, as they translate it from Xhosa and Zulu, means something like, we are shitting all over you, all over this place, all over this thing, right? So it's a particular imagination of a kind of a feminism that is quite aggressive, that's quite in your face, that is deliberately, in a sense, kind of disrespectful or indecorous, right? It's a certain kind of feminism that's quite indecorous, and it's very much informed by kind of intersectional feminism, by a feminism of black bodies, brown bodies, bodies that are already marked as impure, unclean, unwelcome, etc., under the kind of colonial regime of white supremacy, right? These are sort of all the things that inform their project. And I could go on for ages about them, so I'll just leave it with that. And I'll give you this one last quote, and then we'll start the video. So this is in the words of Faka themselves, saying, queer and femme bodies have been erased from the movement, from Qom. We hope to disrupt this narrative by being visible as who we are. In the lyrics of Uyang Kumbula, we talk about our childhood encounters of romance with boys who later in life learned to suppress their desire for us because they feared existing outside of heteronormativity. So with that, again, I won't play the whole thing, but I'll play a substantial bit of it, and then we'll move on from there.
besilale spancheni kantina ngenye mini besilele fatini itamala sibata besizane kishini sugele kuseni kwa bela emini uyangi kumbula besilale spancheni kantina ngenye mini besilele fatini itamala sibata besizane kishini sugele kuseni kwa bela emini Gatini gumnandi, gatini ngumbambe, gatini gumnandi, gatini ngifone, gatini sikhulume, gatini ngibe umuntu wakho, nokuthi yo wenza mahala, wenza acha, wenza fushka, wenza tata, ay 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 ay, ay 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 ay. Kumbula besilale spachini kantina genye mini besilele fatini itamala sibata besizane kishini subele buseni kwa bela emini uyangi kumbula besilale spachini kantina genye mini besilele fatini itamala sibata besizane kishini subele buseni kwa bela emini.
All right, we'll pause it there. Also, there's no good place to stop this. But you'll note here some lots of interesting references going on here visually as well as sonically. There is the glom sort of drum pattern to be found there, but also those who are familiar with, in particular those who watch, for example, RuPaul's Drag Race, you may see some voguing going on in here, right? There's particular sort of gestural patterns, particularly in the hands and in the arms. Not all of it is voguing, right? But there's these interesting brief moments of reference to a kind of global sort of queer sphere of dance and embodiment and movement. You're seeing pretty much all the outfits that they're wearing are from a particular designer that they worked with for this video, and so you can assume a certain amount of sort of coherent intention across all the different outfits that they have here, and they all sort of work through or at least they, I would characterize them as all working and engaging with a kind of gender non-conforming femme presentation. So, primarily skewing towards femme versus masc, at the same time, though, the performers themselves preserving their facial hair, at the same time also wearing outfits that sometimes show flat chests, for example. So there's a sort of a play with the, or a deliberate sort of undermining or or making fluid of the relationship between, body shape, body presentation, sartorial choice, so on, right? And all of these quite powerfully reference a very, a sort of irresolvably queer, sort of identity, one that's not easily, or it's very difficult to sort of pin down to particular identity categories. And that's then placed in these backdrops, these really interesting backdrops. There's very little inner city to be had here. It's actually a very non-urban video. You have countryside, you have sort of desert-like spaces, but you also have sort of these interesting interstitial liminal spaces. You have the border lands, so to speak, of sort of township, or otherwise, urban but not wealthy urban spaces, and so on. So that juxtaposition, I think, is also quite interesting in the context of this the larger framing of this song as being one of, do you remember the times that we had? Do you remember these emotional connections that are no longer there or that you've suppressed in time? So if that's a kind of a call in, or at least I'll flag that initially as a kind of a call in. How are we doing for time? 8:44, all right. And I should be wrapped up before 9 is what I'm saying. Yeah, gotcha. All right, so here I'm going to show you a bit from a short documentary made by Resident Advisor about the protests in Tbilisi in Georgia last year. So last May of 2018, there were very violent raids on two electronic dance music venues, essentially two nightclubs in Tbilisi, Bassiani and Cafe Gallery. Notably, Cafe Gallery was one of the first venues to openly welcome LGBTQ patrons to their venue, and in many ways paid for it in lots of ways. And Bassiani is a club that has been running, that was running weekly events, which included a monthly queer event as well. Georgia at the time, and still does, have extremely punitive drug laws and regulations. And on the back of some drug deaths that had happened in the days prior, there was this very brutal and quite violent raid on these two venues. The managers were arrested, taken in, I think initially under charges of being drug dealers or something like that. Part of the scandal that emerged afterwards was that nobody was actually apprehended for drug dealing or having drugs on them at either of the raids. All of the drug dealers that were allegedly apprehended during that night's activities had been apprehended even before the clubs had been raided. They had been apprehended on the streets or in other venues. So this turned into a massive protest that in the end lasted for several days before the Minister of the Interior came out to make a statement essentially committing to changing legislation around drugs and drug enforcement. And so what's interesting and what's notable is that these protests took the form of essentially an impromptu rave organized in the main city square in front of the Parliament buildings, and the soundtrack to this was techno. So what's interesting here is the ways in which electronic dance music here was used as sort of a tool for a certain kind of a call out and a certain kind of call for, as protest music, but also as music that was supposed to be calling for political change, to place pressure. And the music, let's say the characteristics of the music as something bass heavy, loud, amplified over large systems, are all things that also allowed it to be disruptive and to interrupt the sort of reproduction of power, in the parliament through sound. So I'll leave it at that. Play you a little bit of this. There is most of this is in Georgian, but there are subtitles, and I'll just run it for a short bit here.
ხოლო შემდეგ Interpellation-მა კვლავ შეცდომა დაუშვა.
That's Basiani, by the way.
მეორე დღეს უთვალავი ადამიანი ტელევიზორს თავს და ხედავს რომ ქალაქში სიგიჟე ხდება. ათიათასობით ახალგაზრდა თბილისის ცენტრალურ ქუჩაზე შეკრებილადაც ცეკვავს. რასა პროტესტებთ, რა გინდათ? გეკითხებიან ჟურნალისტები და დაბნეული მოქალაქეები. ცეკვა აგრძელებს, პასუხობთ ჩვენ. და ცხადზე ცხადი ხდება, რომ აქ სიყვარულთან და ცეკვასთან დაპირისპირებული მოძალადე უთანასწორო რეპრესიული სისტემის მარცხი გარდაუვალია.
ქალებს გვასწავლიან, რომ უნდა ვიყოთ დამჯერი, უნდა ვიყოთ მოკრძალებული, ნაზი, რომ ლამაზი მხოლოდ იმ შემთხვევაში ვარ, თუ კონკრეტულ გარკვეულ სტანდარტებში ვჯდებით.
Pause it there. It goes on. It's quite interesting. It's about 5 minutes long for the whole document if you're interested in it. So there I'm sort of highlighting this is an example of a kind of a call out or music being used as a call out. But here, what's interesting to me about this example is this is not one where we're looking at lyrical content making a kind of lexical call out, but rather a particular musical style and genre being deployed in a specific sonic environment to have an effect that, at least to my analysis, is like a call out, right? The presence, taking techno, which in that context at the time would normally have been hidden in spaces, marginal spaces in the city, away from authorities and generally denigrated, to have that then pushed into the public sphere and placed right in front of the parliamentary buildings is in and of itself a certain kind, for me at least, I read that as a kind of a call out, and making use of techno in this case as a kind of call out. So here we sort of head into the last bit. So I want to think about call as calling, so heeding a call or to find a calling. The two examples that I'm going to give you here are quite contrasting, both in how they respond to the notion of the call or of calling, being called, but also even the tone of the levity, seriousness versus humor, and also musical style. So, and I have just a little bit of prepared text for this first bit here. Where are we here? Yes. So the first example that I want to look at or spend some time with here is the work of Underground Resistance, a collective of DJs and producers operating in Detroit since the 1990s with a very explicit anti-racist and anti-authoritarian political orientation, which is figured in their artwork through imagery of futuristic battle against white supremacy. So there's a certain kind of Afrofuturism built into it. Galaxy to Galaxy, which is who we'll be hearing here, is a sort of a subgroup of Underground Resistance specializing in what they called high-tech jazz. And they released a track in 2005 entitled Transition. As we hear this, hopefully you'll get an idea of what high-tech jazz means to them. It's a very interesting sort of amalgamation of techno and jazz influences. So in contrast to the use of vocal samples in most electronic dance music, which tends to be fragmented and vague, right? Actually, the Galbi track that you heard earlier is a good example of that, but also Spiral as well, right? There's a tendency in electronic dance music to break up vocal elements, and if anything, actually to break words into phonemes and so on, and to scatter that across the sonic texture, rather than to have the kind of lyrical verse-chorus structure kind of thing. So in contrast to that, the spoken word on this track seems to be designed to maximize comprehension, to ensure that the listener absolutely hears what's going on. It's slow, it's linear, it's clearly enunciated, and it's echoed antiphonally between a masculine and a feminine voice. So this sort of back and forth echo going on, an echo that turns into a call and response. And later in the track, and we won't hear this part, so I just want to describe it, but later in the track, the feminine voice begins to translate the text into Spanish as well. The Underground Resistance crew and collective, while they're predominantly, I'd say, for the most part, African-American Detroiters, they also very explicitly include Latinx folks, including folks who are also, of varying racial and ethnic identities. So at various points, they make a point of including Spanish as one of the languages that they work in. So the speaker in this spoken word addresses the listener directly in the second person, exhorting them to critically assess their current life situation. They advise listeners to cast off their doubts, to quote, find your strength in the sound and prepare to change their lives. So leave it at that. It's very dramatic, but I'll leave it at that and let you listen to it, and then I'll talk a little bit about it afterwards.
There will come a time in your life when you will ask yourself a series of questions. Am I happy with who I am?
Am I happy with who I am?
Am I happy with the people around me?
Am I happy with the people around me?
Am I happy with what I'm doing?
Am I happy with what I'm doing?
Am I happy with the way my life is going?
Am I happy with the way my life is going?
Do I have a life?
Do I have a life?
Or am I just living?
Or am I just living?
Do not let these questions restrain or trouble you. Just point yourself in the direction of your dreams. Find your strength in the sound and make your transition.
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 All right, and with, if we had louder playback, the arrival of those chords, the sort of syncopated chords there, would be very dramatic. And that's sort of one half of the track. So as the track continues, that spoken word returns. It returns then in a bilingual version. But that's roughly already sort of the core of the track right there. So before I go to the next sample, and this will be our last one before I wrap things up, one thing I do want to note, sort of as I leave that transition, if I transition from that transition track, is there, for me at least, there's something quite intimate in the address there. So even though, even though this is a track that is to be broadcast over a sound system, right? This is I should mention as well for those who are who are not intimately familiar with the world of electronic dance music, that this is a capital C classic track. This is a track that since the 90s to now continues to be played. There's an unbroken history, so to speak, of this track being played at particularly techno parties, but broadly speaking, electronic dance music events. So it's a track that keeps coming out, so to speak, out of retirement, if that's the right word. It's a track that has a lot of meaning for a lot of people within these communities. There are many people for whom this track has served as a real sort of important moment of uplift, or an important thing that got them out of a dark place. And this is also, within the community, as the dance music community, as I understand it, or as I've experienced it personally, this is a track that is somewhat exceptional in some ways, right? So part of why I'm focusing on it is that this doesn't necessarily reflect how techno is normally produced or how it normally functions, but rather this is an exceptional case where calls, and in particular where spoken word is really pushed to the front for a particular effect. So, and I want to draw attention to that. All right, so our last example here, and for this one I'm going to have to hop over to YouTube just because I wasn't able to rip the video in such a way where I could get all the subtitles. And this is a case where I think we should get the subtitles. So what we'll be listening to next here is a song called, and this is a recent song, it's a recent release, I think it came out in February, called Emta Njauzak Yamma. This is by Dam, which is a hip-hop outfit, a Palestinian hip-hop outfit based in Lut. They've been active since the late 1990s, and notably they were one of the first hip-hop crews to work primarily in Arabic, so they've been around for a while, so to speak. They do also rap in English and in Hebrew. And I'll leave it at that as far as the background's concerned. I'll say that the song itself, the entire song, is sort of framed as a response to a call. So I'll leave that as sort of just some framing for you to listen, and then I'll talk about it afterwards. I'll give you my analysis afterwards.
انت نجوزك يما امتى تيجي انت Don't worry انا اوكي كله مظبط كله مسوقي Don't worry انا اوكي بلا هالمشكنتة ومتخوزي
I'm going to pause there and kind of rewind back to about here. Yes, there we go. Just because, as you noticed, some calling just happened. And you might be able to sort of follow on with the subtitles, but essentially the verb to tell and to sing are repeated a couple times. Tell them, sing to them, and then the response is, I'm okay, don't worry about me, don't pressure me into marriage. In both of those instances, we have the artist Maisa, the woman who's in the middle in the black sort of gown, adopt a particular, a very sort of stylized hand gesture and hand position, right? Associated with, on the one hand, we can associate it with calling, but also with ululation, right? Ululation being a very particular, I wouldn't say unique to Middle Eastern, but like, let's say North African, Middle Eastern practice of a sort of vocalization that can express joy, but also despair, and more broadly speaking, can express high affective emotional states. So what's interesting, if you watch closely as this goes along, is the first time that she says kullulo, which means sing to them, and I think it's relulo as well kululu is to tell, khalilu I think is to sing, if I'm not mistaken. The first time that you get each of those verbs, you can see that she is mouthing those words. The second time that each of those happens, she's actually ululating underneath her veil. Right? You can sort of see that if you look carefully at her teeth and her tongue. And then that transitions into a whole other scene, a sort of marital preparation, bridal preparation scene. And I'll play through that for a bit, and then I'll sort of cut it off there.
Don't worry أنا أوكي كله مظبط كله مسوقي Don't worry أنا أوكي بلا هالمشكنتة ومتخوزي
7 ألارمات ديك بدق عالباب وانا تحت الحاف امي عالبلكون جيرتي دبري عريس احصائيات اغلب الازواج بتنامش على نفس الفراش امي عالايفون سيري زبطي عريس قوله لابن الحلال يستنى لانه العالم عم بستناني بلاقي شريكي بعد ما الاقي حالي حاليا صحتي العزوبيه صباح الظهريه المرخيه
انت نجوزك يما.
All right, I'll pause it there. It seems like a good spot to pause in a celebration of single life. So let's wrap things up here. The call. So here, let me see if I can wrap things up a little bit and put something of a bow on top of everything. So what is a call? A call, a perusal of even the most abridged dictionaries or thesauri will reveal a range of definitions and meanings, but all of these are traceable in some way back to something like this. A call is a mode of sonic engagement with others, but engagement is perhaps too vague and too bloodless. A call is a mode of entanglement that is intentional and forceful. By intentional, I mean that to call is always to call someone, to call a thing. A call has an intended addressee, an entity with which the caller seeks to connect, right? Calling somebody's name, calling somebody names, right? A call is also forceful in that it expects a response, and that expectation is enforced through social norms, through culturally established formal conventions, and asymmetries of power. So you can think of greetings, but also call and response dynamics, legal systems that also have there's a whole other paper that you could write about the use of the word call and appeal in legal systems and how that's used to sort of soften the flow of power, or to lubricate, I would say, the flow of power. So it is this vectorization of force through sound and sociocultural webs of power that makes the call an ethical genre in some sense. Not ethical in the sense of good ethics, but a genre that has ethical implications, right? A genre of interaction, a sonic genre that has ethical implications. So, what is a call as a sonic act? The call is an interjection, a vibratory burst that pierces soundscapes, penetrates spaces, and disrupts discourse. It's an interruption, but maybe also a beginning. Maybe the start of an exchange, whether it's friendly or antagonistic, or maybe something that ends in silent dismissal. What is a call as a genre of sociability? Here I'm understanding genre in the sense of like a bundle of conventions or structures of expectations, right? So genre, and here I'm thinking in relation to like Lauren Berlant's the way that she riffs on the idea of gender as genre in her book, The Female Complaint, or Chris Kronengold's account of musical genre and kind of exchanges between genres in particular in the relation to disco and the way in which related genres can sort of exchange conventions, right? So a bundle of conventions. So in that context, the call is a genre of everyday interaction, one with a degree of formalism. It expects a response or at least a recognition and an acknowledgement. And one can think here of the formalities of telephone calls, for example, and the anxieties attendant to answering telephone calls away from home. So in other words, in foreign countries or places where you don't know the language, the local etiquette, and the codes. And these days, in fact, it's quite interesting that there's more and more anxiety about actually, especially non-consensual phone calls, so to speak, when you call somebody without giving them a warning via text message, right? That for people more and more, that's a source of great anxiety. So the call folds and unfolds social relations. And I want to use that metaphor fold, I think, here. So the call folds and unfolds social relations. It can pull us in and it can push us out. It can lift us up or it can also cast us down. In all of those instances, it's productive of relations, of social relations, but those relations may be antagonistic relations. And so what is the call as an ambivalent ethics? And so here I see the call as a forceful kind of interpolation, one that can call us out as much as call us in. Yes, it's pro-social. Perhaps we return to this idea of the call is pro-social, but who's social, right? What kind of social? To whom, for what benefit that social? The call can both disrupt order and impose order in various ways. And most importantly, at least for me, the call can fail. The call can be ignored, it can be refused, it can be questioned, and even subverted. And here's where misinterpolation in particular becomes quite important. And so where I want to end things here is with a sort of a call for essentially for an archive of calls. So I've gone through a few musical examples. These I've pulled from my own archive from what I already know. But this, for me, will hopefully become a larger project. This will become something bigger. And as it does build and accumulate and snowball and so on, I'm very interested to hear from you and from anybody, also out there on the interwebs, the intertubes as it may be, what other kinds of sonic calls exist, or what other ways can we, what other examples can we work with, can I work with, or can we work with collectively, to think about calls in a more complex way, in particular to think about them in a more nuanced way that thinks about their ethical implications, their imbrication in systems of both power and empowerment and so on. So I'd like to call towards building an archive of calls, and there, I also want to point to a few questions that remain unanswered. So sort of where to go next with this. What traces do calls leave in the world? I haven't thought yet. I haven't really thought much about the materiality of calls and particular material traces, and I'd like to think about that more in the future. Also, are all calls performative? Are they always illocutionary? Following the Austin / Butler notion of performativity, right? Does making a call always perform an act in doing so? Does it always transform reality? Can we think of any instances where calls don't transform reality in that way? And so I end this talk much where I started. Calls are everywhere in our sonic worlds. Calls expect a response, but from whom? Calls may have a specific addressee, but almost anyone can answer them. Calls exert social force, but in ambivalent ways. And calls can go wrong, and maybe for me that's the most important part. Thank you very much.
My question is about loudness, just the volume, sound pressure levels of these calls, and I'm thinking specifically about parties that it's kind of it maybe you consider it a failed, like the idea of a empty bar blaring super loud music,
right.
For example. I guess my question is, has has just the idea of loudness in general, whether in EDM or elsewhere, come up in your work on this project?
Right. So I'd say not yet in that framing, but thank you for that. I will take that. In the sense that there are lots of ways that you could riff off of that, right? Certainly, on the one hand, in the kind of rave world, and I'm thinking here very biographically, I'll admit, right? So in younger years when I was trying to track down illegal underground raves where that were not posted anywhere and that were in illicit venues that could not be easily findable, so to speak, the fact that bass in particular propagates and transmit that goes far, right? That treble tends to get stopped by buildings, but bass actually goes quite far. Was an important and well-known means of finding where the party was, right? That you would sometimes be given vague directions that were not particularly useful or helpful. You might get lost once or twice, but something you could do is listen for the bass thump and orient yourself that way. And I even had experiences of that in urban environments in the kind of more recent times as well. When traveling abroad in cities that I don't know, if I'm looking for a club, certainly one of the ways to sort of locate it is through bass in particular, but it has to be loud bass for that to work, right? But also, I think more broadly speaking, and here is maybe where my focus is more specifically musical and not necessarily sound, broadly speaking, but the kind of conspicuous presence and even sometimes imposition of music in a particular space can also be a kind of a call, right? And I'm thinking of, but on one hand, to call, calling customers in. I think of all sorts of, restaurants, drinking establishments and so on that I've either been in or worked at or what have you, where the musical sound tracking is important for bringing people in. And in fact, if there aren't enough people in there, you throw open the doors and have the music blast out onto the street, and that's part of how you're supposed to at least implicitly call people in. I can also think though of especially friends of mine who work as bartenders making particular musical choices towards the end of the night when they want everybody to get the heck out, right? And there's a whole set of tricks and techniques around that, some of which has to do with loudness, some of which has to do with abrupt changes in style, or even down to knowing specifically what things piss off your regulars and send them home. But there again, that's not quite a it's not quite a call per se, but maybe it's something else that's also maybe interesting to think about, the use of music to drive people away in that context, right? I feel like I had one last thing to say to that, but it'll come to me, of course, later, probably tomorrow morning. But in the meanwhile, let's turn to another question.
So this was fantastic. I'm going to pick your brain like crazy at our meeting. But one thing that's specifically stuck out to me was the concept of misinterpolation. And what struck me was how that could interplay with calls to action, especially competing calls to action, such as in large-scale protests like the one in Tbilisi. And I was just wondering if you could speak to how that interaction works with this concept of the call as a sonic force.
Right. That's really interesting. Thank you. Great question. I think, at least with the Tbilisi example, that if anything sort of highlights it doesn't so much question or undermine misinterpolation as a distinct category, but rather it highlights the interesting gradients in between interpolation and misinterpolation, right? And this connects to sort of a broader, I got mail. This connects to a broader sort of scholarly landscape around, for example, public sphere theory as well, and how we theorize publics. Right? That part of what makes a public is that any kind of a text or utterance that you push out into it circulates publicly, and you're not allowed to have complete control over who gets to see it, because that's what makes it a public, right? That part of, and this is also with social media and the so-called context collapse experiences, right, where people write a thing, they tweet a thing, or more often post a thing on Facebook or Insta, assuming a specific readership. And it turns out that it's a much larger one who then perhaps drags them on the internet. All of that connects to this notion of broadcasting, and that broadcasting meaning that sometimes it's going to get picked up by folks you did not want to pick it up. And so going back to the Tbilisi example, you have, on the one hand, there are ways in which that it seems like that story, it seems like some of something like misinterpolation was a beneficial sort of beneficial phenomenon, in the sense that it seemed like that protest really accumulated volume and strength, and seemed to bring in people who weren't necessarily at the club when the raids happened, who weren't necessarily members of any one of these specific communities, but heard about this larger terrible thing that had happened. And you'll notice, of course, the age range in that video was really, really clear, right? So it became a sort of youth protest movement. It became a movement of protest around drug legalization, for example. So in going to misinterpolation, what's interesting is that Basiani, one of the two clubs that was raided, they had already for quite some time been collaborating. Collaborating is a terrible word for that. They had already been strategically working with an NGO, the name of which I can't remember quite off the top of my head, but an NGO that was working towards deregulation, or if not decriminalization of drugs in Georgia. So Basiani was already kind of on the radar of the police for pushing for a sort of a softening of these things. All of that was already there in the mix. So it was very, from a distance, I wasn't on the ground there, but it seems like it was very, it was not hard for the call to protest the raids and the unfairness of the raids to turn into a larger complaint around around, on the one hand, drug laws and enforcement, but also around nightlife enforcement, broadly speaking, also around the repression of queer sexual spaces, and otherwise sort of safe spaces for non-cisgendered folks. That all of those things sort of clustered together into this large sort of pan protest. And once again, I feel like I had another thing I wanted to say to that, but it'll come to me later. Thank you so much, though.
A couple of quick things. Thank you. This was a great deal to think about. The one thing I'm wondering about is in context where people are risking jail time, violence, all of this. Do they intentionally, can calls also have double entendre? Can they be, so that you can say, oh no, we didn't mean that, we meant this.
Yeah.
Does that ever happen?
Right, yeah, I'm certainly, short answer is, I guess so, absolutely. I can imagine that happening. I can't think yet, of the archive that I've worked with, so to speak, in the sense of just musical examples that I've been looking at. I can't think of any good examples there, but but yeah, I mean, I can imagine how that would work within this sort of frame of the call, right? Of already with misinterpolation being this one way of thinking about a call being meant for one person or meant for one destination, so to speak, but also heard by others, right? Certainly, I can think about that in relation to, well, for example, the Shanida project in particular. Of Fatima Al Qadiri as also playing with sort of layered coding, right? And in particular, I mean, I think both in, I think we could go to, on the one hand, sort of studies, literary and cultural studies of queer culture, broadly understood, but also sort of post-migrant of color, and otherwise racialized communities as well for kind of multi-layered coding. We can also think, we can go all the way to kind of Henry Louis Gates and signifying as well, to think about that as well, the ways in which it's much in the way that a text can be, text can be encoded with several layers of meaning, which can be destined for several different audiences, essentially for the benefit of different readers and listeners. I can imagine a call as being just as rich and just as textured and just as complex. That said, I got to go away and think about that as far as whether or not I can come up with a good concrete example of that, like one that would be sort of worthy of, not worthy, but one that would provide a productive analysis. But thank you. I'm going to check that out.
There's a question from Jordan Zalas, who's asking if you can speak more about failed calls, which you mentioned, and if and here he was thinking about unsuccessful marketing campaigns. Just if you can address that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I ended the presentation anyways by saying that interpolation calls can fail, and that's maybe the most interesting thing. I can think of, So actually less marketing campaigns for me, although I can see where the connection would be there. In the world of kind of electronic dance music, techno, etc., that I've worked in, where I've seen some interesting failed calls has been when, for example, a music venue that does not have a particularly illustrious history as a safe space of any sort, sticks an announcement on their Instagram account saying, "We're a safe space. We have always supported these people." And that often does not go down well in the sense that, or not often, but let's say, what happens because the world is what it is, and in particular social media is what it is that people who have then been to that venue then speak up and say, well, actually, no, you have not been safe in the past, and these sort of claims. What is a very, or what works as a very coded call, so to speak, at least in this current moment. There is. For venues, especially dance music venues, to say we're safe spaces, or to say that we are spaces that are safer for people of color, for women, trans, non-binary, non-gender conforming, etc., to make that claim is supposed to be a claim that comes with a great deal of responsibility and accountability and so on. And that is not always the case. It is sometimes deployed precisely for marketing, so to speak, or to sometimes sort of whitewash, if that's the right word, past things that have occurred there and so on. That's a great example, or I can think of several examples, some of many of which I can't quite name here, where that call absolutely falls flat in the sense that that call is made. It's supposed to be, the idea is that that call goes out and resonates with those people of color, those trans folks, those women who see that and whose concerns are supposed to be assuaged, that they're supposed to now feel comfortable going to this space, and who instead say, no, we already know, or we've already had those experiences, or we maintain our own network of information, and we know different. I can beyond that, I can also think of failed calls in the context of sort of rehabilitation of artists, problematic artists in the dance music world. And again, here I can think that this exists in lots of other genres and so on. It's not just dance music. But there had already been, like starting from about 2010, I would say, there was, we began to see in electronic music sort of journalism and so on, articles calling out in initially kind of gentle terms things like, hey, why does the top 100 DJs list this year and every year for the last 20 years not had a single woman in it, or had literally a single woman in it? What's up with that? And that has changed things over time, but that started, at least by about 2010, I was seeing examples of that. Since then, we've gone to having much more sort of much more specific and, let's say, much more engaged sort of debates about not just that, but also talking about harassment in clubs, talking about booking policies of clubs and festivals, talking about racism or cultural appropriation, all these sorts of things. And in the when Me Too was happening, it also happened in the dance music scene in various ways. Certainly not, I think, to the same sort of, I don't know if it had the same thorough, I don't know if it went as deep as the Weinstein scandal did in Hollywood, but there were multiple disclosures in the dance music scene, and on the back of that, there were, I wouldn't say numerous, but there were a number of artists in the electronic dance music world who found themselves on the wrong end of that, so to speak, and who were certainly encouraged to take a step back and maybe reconsider themselves and how they do their things and reapproach at a later date. And artists, those artists who found themselves in that position, some of them took really different responses to that. So some of them did sort of step out of the spotlight for a while, make the necessary apologies, did some work to make amends, that sort of a thing, and then tried to sort of return to something like a normal career. But others, it seems, employed PR companies and tried to do a kind of a comeback tour without necessarily having done all the other bits that you're supposed to do before you have the comeback to her. Essentially kind of like Louis C.K., but if you imagine, with the same kind of attempt and then also failures attached to it as Louis C.K. So that's also, I think, another example of where there was a lot of failed calls in the electronic dance music world recently. Has been certain artists and certain collectives and so on trying to push their way back in without sufficiently engaging with the thing that pushed them out, so to speak.
Well, I think that's all we have time for this evening. I'd like to thank Dr. Garcia for such a wonderful talk with so many rich and suggestive ideas. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Video producer Spencer Crew, social media producer Dr. Megan Forsyth, production assistants Peter Verdon and Kirsten Faj, and all of you for coming. If you missed any part of tonight's talk, you can find it on our YouTube channel. It will be posted in the next few weeks. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.